At 06:12 a.m., the Strait of Hormuz looked almost peaceful in the first satellite passes, just a narrow band of water cutting between rock and desert, a world economy bottleneck hiding in plain sight. By 06:19, that calm began to break apart. Gray silhouettes pushed into the frame, one after another, not as individual ships, but as a single moving structure. A U.S. carrier strike group sliding into a corridor so tight that sailing stops being routine and turns into doctrine. Tankers advanced in disciplined lines along invisible traffic lanes drawn into the sea. There was no open ocean to drift into, no extra room to correct a mistake. In Hormuz, every mile is observed, every degree of heading matters, and every decision gets louder, simply because geography amplifies it. The carrier sat at the center, like a floating metropolis. Thousands of crew, aircraft stacked across the deck like force made visible. Destroyers held forward and rear positions, a cruiser offset to extend the radar horizon, another hull keeping separation to widen the air picture. On their own, each ship was a threat. Together, they functioned like one weapon with multiple hands. From Tehran's perspective, this passage was never just transit. It was a daily reminder of an imbalance Iran had spent decades trying to correct, without trying to match the price tag. The United States could pay for dominance. Iran could only afford to make dominance feel expensive. Not fleet versus fleet, pressure versus certainty. And Hormuz was the perfect chamber to test that idea at maximum volume. Nearly a fifth of the world's oil moves through this funnel. Every market understands the math. Every government understands the risk. If a regional power could convincingly threaten this choke point, it could threaten more than ships. It could threaten confidence. That was always the real objective. Not metal, not engines, perception.
Iran's doctrine here was asymmetric control, in its most distilled form. Missiles instead of carriers, drones instead of space-based coverage, mines instead of warship lines, fast boats instead of air wings. The purpose was never to win a traditional naval battle. The purpose was to make presence feel like pain. Even minor damage to a carrier, just enough to bruise the myth, would echo through capitals overnight. American naval power would stop feeling absolute. Carriers would stop feeling untouchable. The U.S. calculation ran in the opposite direction. If you avoid Hormuz, you lose more than water. You surrender the principle that intimidation can rewrite international lanes. Every passage through the strait was movement, yes, but it was also messaging. If the United States hesitated here, that hesitation would become precedent. So the formation held its line. At 06:44 a.m., the flight deck looked almost normal. Yellow shirts waved calm signals. Crews moved with that practiced rhythm that makes dangerous work look casual. From the outside, the carrier appeared steady, almost indifferent. But in the escorts and deep inside the Combat Information Center, calm didn't exist as a concept. Every screen was a future that hadn't happened yet. At 07:11, signals intelligence caught a slight change along the northern coastline. No dramatic spike, no obvious alarm, just a shift in the cadence of encrypted traffic between coastal sectors. Routine chatter is chaotic, preparation is often quiet. At 07:24, a short phrase began repeating inside longer transmissions. Nothing theatrical, nothing overtly threatening. It wasn't coordinates, it wasn't ideology. It sounded like administration, scheduling language, a window, and windows meant timing. Timing meant synchronization. Synchronization meant multiple units operating under one plan. At 07:38, one destroyer increased radar sweep tempo. More updates per second, more chances to catch something before it became distance. A cruiser brought additional sensors online, sharpening the air picture into tighter detail. Across the group, data links tightened, each ship feeding the others, turning separate hulls into a single, integrated mind. At 07:52, surface contacts spilled out from an inlet north of Keshem Island. Too small to be commercial, too fast to be accidental. Their numbers shifted as they darted between islands, disappearing into clutter, and returning again in new angles. Minutes later, low-altitude returns flickered above the coast, small enough to resist clean classification, consistent enough to refuse dismissal. This is how saturation begins, not with the first missile. It always starts the same way, not with the strike itself, but with the thing meant to pull your eyes away. Iran understood the carrier group's biggest edge wasn't firepower, it was warning time.
The earlier you see danger, the more space you have to crush it. But Hormuz steals space. Here, geography squeezes reaction windows down to seconds, and seconds turn into survival. The air picture becomes a crowded maze, where one wrong assumption can become a casualty list. At 0806, a civilian tanker pushed a report through open maritime channels. Strange light flickers along the northern shoreline. No military confirmation, no precision, just a commercial voice describing something that didn't belong. Inside the Combat Information Center, noise was never treated like nothing. At 0812, the overhead feed refreshed and tightened. Multiple mobile launch indicators, fresh heat signatures, vehicles repositioning into points that looked pre-measured long before this morning. The pattern wasn't messy, it wasn't improvised, it was staged. At 0816, one intercepted line cut through everything else. Not because it sounded aggressive, but because it sounded ordinary. No slogans, no threats, no emotion, just operational language, repeated calmly, like a checklist being read aloud to someone already in position. Window opens in 30. The most lethal words in conflict are rarely dramatic. They're the ones that sound procedural. Up on the bridge, the sea still looked deceptively peaceful. Sun on water. A corridor of ships moving in disciplined order like a convoy from a different era. But below decks, the strike group had already shifted, not into panic, into posture. At 0820, the captain ordered full defensive readiness without altering course. No sharp turns, no visible reaction. Because doctrine mattered as much as steel in Hormuz. A flinch out here wouldn't stay a flinch, it would become a lesson. Something studied, copied, and weaponized the next time. So the formation held steady and waited for the window to open. At 0824, the strait felt narrower, even though the charts hadn't changed. The traffic lanes were still clean lines on navigation displays, but now they felt like rails instead of guidance. You didn't maneuver freely here. You moved only as the corridor allowed. And somewhere on the northern shore, someone was counting seconds like ammunition. Inside the CIC, the air was dry and sterile under the glow of screens that never blinked. Voices cut down into fragments, numbers, short confirmations, clipped calls. Nobody debated, nobody narrated. The moment demanded procedures, drilled so hard they lived in the hands. Across the group, the data links fused into a single shared brain. Radar tracks layered with surface contacts. Electro-optical cues stitched into the map. Signals intercepts pinned to coastlines. The carrier wasn't protected by escorts so much as wrapped inside an architecture. Stacked layers of detection and response, each one buying time for the next. Iran knew that architecture. They had studied it for years, not with carriers of their own, but with simulations, training cycles, archived engagements, translated doctrine manuals, and officers taught to believe in one core principle. You don't have to sink the carrier. You just have to break through once. One strike on the flight deck, one explosion inside a hangar, one fire that burns long enough to be filmed and uploaded. That alone would reshape headlines, spike insurance rates, rattle markets, and force every navy on the planet to quietly reevaluate what safe passage actually means. That was the bet. At 0831, U.S. signals intelligence flagged a burst of encrypted traffic flowing from Bandar Abbas into smaller coastal nodes. The pattern didn't match routine monitoring. It was too organized, too fast, too distributed. This wasn't watching, this was steering. Then the detail that turned the room colder arrived without fanfare. Short, go confirmations, appearing again and again, sector to sector. Exactly the kind of language used when multiple units are waiting on a single trigger. The plan wasn't forming, it was already written. Now the only question was whether it would be executed. At 0837, the first drone swarm was confirmed. Tiny, low-altitude returns moving in loose bands, drifting toward shipping lanes with a purpose that looked almost careless. They weren't there to destroy anything. They were there to occupy attention, to demand classification, to drain operator focus, to force systems to choose which tracks mattered. Clutter wasn't a side effect. Clutter was a weapon. At 0841, the surface picture shifted again. Fast boats multiplied and spread out in thin arcs. Some hugged islands, some slipped near civilian traffic, hiding inside commercial movement like cover. It was the kind of setup designed to make every decision dangerous. Fire on the wrong contact, even once, and the political damage would be immediate. Iran didn't need to hit the carrier to win the day. They only needed hesitation, or a mistake. The American response stayed disciplined, No warning shots, no dramatic radio calls, just geometry, distance, and rules built for exactly this kind of theater. Helicopters launched and held at standoff ranges. Sensors tracked everything. Fire control solutions were generated and held, like a finger resting on the trigger without pulling. Silence wasn't weakness. Silence was control. At 0846, the message arrived the way the worst confirmations always do. Quietly. Not a speech, not a manifesto, just the same short phrase again, now welded to a timestamp that erased all doubt. Authorization window opens 0900 cluck. That was the moment uncertainty died. Still, the strike group refused to advertise fear. No turn away, no sudden speed change, no aggressive choreography for the shoreline cameras. In Hormuz, movement itself is a signal. Every adjustment becomes intelligence for the other side. Sprinting reads as anxiety. Retreat reads as weakness. Firing first buys seconds but burns legitimacy. The safest posture was the one that looked like routine traffic, while loading every defensive system underneath into lethal focus. At 0852, the escorts climbed into their highest alert state. Radar filters sharpened. Threat bands were carved into the shared map. Engagement zones snapped into place like a locking mechanism. The carrier's aircraft were ready, but the strait's geometry punished the wrong launch as harshly as an enemy hit. In confined waters, the greatest advantage wasn't a sword you might swing later. It was the shield you already wore. At 0857, heat blooms appeared along the northern coast. Not one position, several. Spread far enough to complicate interception timing, yet coordinated closely enough to collapse toward the same endpoint. Iran had framed this as a math problem. Overwhelm the defense by forcing it to solve too many equations at once. 40 seconds to 9, 30, 20. At 0900 AM, nothing changed to the naked eye. Tankers stayed in line. The carrier remained on its invisible rails. The sky looked empty. Then the launches hit the screens. Bright strokes tearing off the coastline so fast you missed them unless you were staring at the right sensor feed. And in seconds, the air picture became chaos. Dozens of hostile tracks. Low altitude, high velocity, staggered starts designed to arrive together. Behind them came drones, decoys, false echoes, the storm behind the storm. It wasn't just an attack, it was an attempt to overload the mind and stress the machine. Inside the CIC, the alarm didn't sound emotional, it sounded mechanical, like a switch being thrown. Vampire, then again. Vampire, then again. The defense wasn't waking up, it was already awake. Because in Hormuz, the next 4 minutes wouldn't just decide damage. They would decide ownership of the narrative once the smoke cleared. At 09 minutes 14, the first wave came in low and fast, riding the sea as if fear didn't exist. These missiles weren't climbing into clean radar space. They stayed down in the clutter, where every track has to be pulled out of noise by force. Iran had built this strike like a net. Multiple launch sites, multiple approach angles, delayed arrivals timed to converge into the same kill zone. Some weapons came early to pull interceptors. Others followed seconds later to enter the same airspace when the defense was already busy. This wasn't wild firing. It was choreography. Months of planning compressed into a few hundred seconds of violence. Flight time was under 5 minutes. In those minutes, a carrier strike group either proved its doctrine in public or watched the world rewrite what American protection truly meant. At 09 minutes 26, the forward destroyer's radar delivered the first clean locks into the shared network. Symbols multiplied across every screen. Missiles, decoys, drones, surface clutter. The threat wasn't a line, it was a moving cloud. The first human feeling is always the same. Compression. Too many parts, too little time. Then the system stepped forward. At 09 minutes 31, the integrated combat network sorted the tracks, ranked them by speed and altitude, and assigned engagement zones automatically. No debate, no pointing, no commander wasting breath on that one. The machine did what it was built to do, buy time. At 90 kilometers, the outer ring opened. Long-range interceptors fired in pairs, not because one couldn't work, but because redundancy is the religion of survival. 2 per threat, again and again. Cold math applied at brutal speed. The closing rates were violent. The geometry gave no mercy. The first Iranian missile disappeared in a mid-air flash at 87 kilometers. Then another. Then another. Each kill was a tiny star in the morning sky, too distant for deck crews to witness, but on the screens, confirmations arrived clean and clinical. efficient, emotionless. Iran had planned to fight separate ships. They were fighting a single organism. At 70 kilometers, the second layer activated. Different interceptors, different profiles, stacked redundancies. The strike group wasn't defending one carrier. It was defending an idea. And ideas are defended with excess. Tracks vanished one after another, but more kept pushing in. Because saturation doesn't win by landing the first spear. It wins by throwing a storm until something slips through. At 091 minutes 42 seconds, the engagement moved into the band where radar becomes cruel. Sea skimmers dropped lower, using the curve of the earth and the noise of waves as camouflage. At 15 meters above water, a missile isn't just a target, it's a disappearing problem. This was Iran's best window. At 35 kilometers, the inner ring opened. Short-range interceptors snapped off their rails with brutal violence, their launches now visible as brief orange cuts of flame along escort decks. The defense stopped being lines on a screen. It became physical. The air above the water filled with intersecting paths that lived for seconds and ended in sharp flashes. Missiles died ahead of the formation like bugs hitting a windshield. And still, a few kept sliding through. Because saturation is never judged by the first kills, it's judged by what survives the layers. At 0902 minutes 17 seconds, several hostile tracks broke through the last, clean band and dropped into the most dangerous space imaginable. Close range, sea skimming altitude, compressed time. The network could still process, still assign, still fire, but comfort was gone. Only seconds remained. On the carrier's deck, sailors began to see thin vapor scars in the distance. Not cinematic trails, not bright streaks, just wrong lines above calm water that made the body react before the mind fully named the threat. At 0902 minutes 39 seconds, the closest-in weapons came alive. 6-barreled cannons spun up with a mechanical scream, tracking faster than human sight could follow. 4,000 rounds a minute, 20mm tungsten. The objective wasn't precision, it was deletion. The sound wasn't gunfire, it was tearing fabric, continuous, violent, industrial. One incoming missile came apart at 8 kilometers. Another broke at 6. Pieces hit the sea and vanished without ceremony. But a third track kept its shape. 4 kilometers. Less than 20 seconds. Inside the Combat Information Center, nobody spoke. The display reduced everything to a single, brutal truth. A closing line slicing toward the carrier's protected space. The room wasn't filled with fear. It was filled with concentration so sharp, it felt like pressure. At 0902 minutes 58 seconds, an escort threw a point-blank interceptor into the corridor. It left the launcher and immediately began hunting, chasing the incoming threat inside the final tight lane like an animal released at close range. Impact at 2.4 kilometers. A white flash, a hard bloom of debris. But nothing in the system exhaled, because the screen still showed something alive. A smaller return, maybe fragments, maybe a second body, maybe the last misdirection buried inside the plan. Iran had seeded uncertainty into the wave. Decoys weren't an accessory, they were doctrine. The defense didn't assume safe until the air was empty. At 090306, the nearest escort fired again. Cannons chewed the remaining return at under a kilometer from the carrier's ring. Debris hammered the water ahead like handfuls of thrown gravel. And then, the picture began to clear. Not dramatically, not all at once, track by track, hostile symbols blinking out until only friendly hulls and civilian traffic remained. The sea resumed its normal noise, like the last 3 minutes had been an argument it refused to remember. At 090312, the final kill confirmation hit the network. No impacts on the carrier, no fires on deck, no casualties. From first detection to last destruction, the tactical fight had lasted less than 3 minutes. A storm of missiles, drones, and noise, erased in front of a formation that never broke its line. But the real result wasn't what had been destroyed. It was what had been exposed. Every battery revealed itself the instant it fired. Every radar that switched to guidance confessed its signature. Every command node that sent a go left a fingerprint in the air. The strike group's defense wasn't only a shield, it was a trap. A net thrown over everything that tried to kill it. And as the last fragments sank, American systems had already shifted focus to the thing Iran hadn't anticipated. They weren't just recording survival, they were drawing the coastline that attacked them. At 0904, the The strike group did the one thing Iran hadn't built into the scenario. Nothing. No immediate Tomahawk response. No retaliatory launch sequence. No jets screaming off the deck on a headline-making surge. Speed remained steady. Formation remained clean. Radio traffic stayed almost boring. From the outside, it looked like the most expensive naval force on Earth had absorbed a major attack and kept moving as if it had been weather. To eyes on the Iranian shore, that silence was unreadable. Their model expected retaliation as reflex. If the US was hit, it struck back hard. If it wasn't hit, it punished the attempt anyway. That assumption was baked into simulations, briefings, and confidence. Fire, trigger response, then manage escalation inside a framework you prepared for. But the framework never activated. Instead, the carrier group moved through Hormuz like a machine that had made its point and refused to explain it. That wasn't restraint. That was discipline so cold it became a weapon of its own. Because while Iran searched for missiles, the strike group was already doing something else. The engagement hadn't been only defense, it had been harvesting. Every radar that switched to guidance handed over its signature like a confession. Every launcher that fired stamped a coordinate into the air. Every encrypted "go" message, no matter how brief, stitched command relationships into something that could be traced, modeled, and understood. The strike had been built to expose American weakness. Instead, it exposed Iranian structure. By 0907, the intelligence cell was turning the coastline into a living blueprint. Launch points pinned, probable reload areas inferred, alternate firing sites predicted from vehicle drift and thermal movement, relay nodes mapped like nerves across a body. The fast boats used as distraction weren't just tracked, they were cataloged, routes logged, staging pockets marked, timing patterns stored. This wasn't a close call anymore. It was a file, an indexed system, a growing library of answers. And for the first time that morning, Hormuz didn't feel like a choke point around the carrier group. It felt like a choke point around the coast that had tried to tighten it. At 0912, the message came across the circuit that mattered most. Short, flat, final. Hold fire, stay on course, continue operations. That order wasn't kindness. It wasn't indecision. It was a refusal to enter someone else's schedule. A rapid counterstrike would satisfy instinct, feed footage, and prove strength. But it would also validate the doctrine Iran wanted to sell. Provoke, shape escalation, claim narrative control through resistance. And it would waste the best gift Iran had just handed over. Because the longer the United States waited, the more it could learn. And the more Iran would begin to fear what had been learned. The strike group cleared the tightest part of the strait and moved into broader water. Space returned, reaction time expanded. The sea stopped squeezing the formation, but the psychological pressure didn't lift. Iranian coastal units stayed at peak alert, expecting punishment. Launch crews remained close. Command nodes kept transmitting. Defensive teams rotated once, then rotated again, burning endurance like fuel. And the worst part wasn't fatigue, it was uncertainty. Had America chosen not to answer? Or had America chosen to answer later, in a form that couldn't be anticipated? That question settled into every bunker and command post like humidity. Quiet, constant, impossible to escape. Days passed, then a week. No strike, no public line, no visible revenge. Inside Tehran, the argument became its own stress fracture. Some insisted the Americans had been deterred. Others insisted the silence was camouflage for preparation. Leadership was forced into the one posture it despised most: waiting. And waiting is never neutral. Waiting locks you in place. It drains initiative. It makes every decision feel like stepping onto a minefield. Stand down too early, and you invite punishment. Escalate too soon, and you invite a trap. So you hover in the worst state imaginable: alive, armed, and unsure. By the second week, the regional picture shifted in ways no press release ever connected to the engagement. A bomber rotation quietly thickened. A new destroyer appeared in a different sector. A submarine, irrelevant to the original transit, slid into a lane that suggested new priorities. Satellite passes were retasked. Surveillance aircraft flew patterns that didn't make headlines, but made analysts stare longer at screens. It wasn't a threat announced out loud. It was a shadow repositioning. Iran tracked every move and tried to interpret it. That effort became the trap. Instead of shaping new operations, they were dragged into defensive anticipation. Their batteries were awake, but frozen. Their boats were active, but cautious. Their commanders couldn't confidently escalate or relax, because either choice could be punished. This is what strategic patience does. It turns the enemy's action into your leverage. The strike group survived the saturation wave. That was the visible outcome. But the invisible outcome was worth more. Iran had exposed its best play, its most rehearsed scenario, its cleanest math, its most confident sequence. And by exposing it, Iran had revealed the locations, frequencies, linkages, and decision chains that made the play possible. The missiles didn't only fail, they talked. Weeks later, the carrier group was still operating. Aircraft still flew routine cycles, sea lanes stayed open, oil kept moving, markets stabilized, then forgot. But Iran didn't forget. Iran couldn't afford to. Their defenses remained tense, their commanders pinned inside a question that grew heavier with time. What does America know now? And what is America building with it? Because patience isn't the absence of response, it's the construction of response. Every day without retaliation is another day of mapping, shifting assets, tightening options, and shaping a strike package chosen not by anger, but by objectives. A response designed for maximum effect, at a time chosen for maximum advantage, not to satisfy emotion, but to change behavior. Iran fired to prove it could create fear. In minutes, that fear was erased. But the deeper defeat wasn't tactical, it was strategic. Iran assumed the United States would answer immediately, or not at all. Instead, the United States chose the third option: absorb the blow, take the data, and let uncertainty do the damage. The fight lasted minutes. The consequences will last as long as Iranian forces remain on alert, burning readiness in the dark, haunted by the simplest rule of modern conflict. The strike you can predict is survivable. The strike you can only imagine is the one that changes your behavior long before it ever lands.